Well, I come from a family of 10 boys and four girls. Basically, my mother, who was adopted by a Pierre Gedwa wasn't her biological father, but of course Pierre Gedwa married Isabel Trecce. Isabel Trecce, you heard of the hockey player Brian Trecce. That would be Brian Trecce's auntie, my grandmother. But he married Pierre Gedwa, and Pierre Gedwa's dad was Simon Gedwa. And Simon Gedwa was approximately 26 years old at the time of the 1885, whatever you call it, the ugly actions that were taken here on the reserve land, Onipo Hills reserve lands. But these stories that was told to me by my mother, they were told to her by her adopted grandfather, Simon Gedwa, who's known as Thin Belly, Papagachas, was a highest degree in herbal medicines. He even had acupuncture. But my mother spent 5 years north of Cold Lake, in Primrose Lake, with her grandfather, Simon Gedwa. They moved there in the spring of April when she was 7 years old. They started their trek on the other side of Cold Lake. And this is where they had no television, no radio or anything, but this is where Simon Gedwa basically gave her all the knowledge and the wisdom that she carried in regards to medicine and the stories that were passed on to her, and all the things that were told regarding the actions that were taken by our peoples here on the Onipo Hills, Reserves 121, numbered as 121. And in regards to what I've heard, it's been passed on by my mother to me at my young age, a lot of repetition that have went on. But also from other elders who talked about what happened at that time. And I've also had recordings of elders when I was a director of Family Community Support Services. And I recorded the elders at that time, but I don't know where those tapes are gone. But in regards to what I heard, it that Big Bear, a tribe, a band that belonged to the tribe of the Prairie people. And because of the way Big Bear was thinking and his thoughts that they should have one big reserve for the Indian nation in this country and not separate small reserves. But whether or not the Prairie people under Big Bear, whether or not it was only a part and parcel of the bigger tribe of the Prairie people, whether or not Big Bear was a band from a fraction of the Prairie tribe, But I heard that he was dissatisfied with what occurred during the talks, and he was not a part of those talks in Fort Carlton or Fort Pitt. But later on, he was a part of the ceremonies that occurred in Sounding Lake. And to me, in accordance to our constitutional law, that the Indian nation is a composition of tribes. And the tribes sometimes broke up into bands. And therefore, in regards to the treaty with the Crown of Great Britain, he was dissatisfied in some of the things, some of the actions that have gone on between the peoples of the Crown of Great Britain, the subjects, and their actions. He was dissatisfied. But however, I believe that he was in agreement with the adhesions, that occurred from across this country with the treaty made between the Crown of Great Britain and the Indian nation of this country. Well, that's why he requested to spend a winter on these reserved lands, Onipo Hills, 121. He asked permission, and he was given that permission to spend a winter on these reserved lands here. And that he would, in the following spring, he would identify reserved lands that he would reserve for his band. And in regards to what our people had said is that in between Elk Point and St. Paul, there's a big dip going, and it's called Dog Rump Creek at the Mushogan Sipi in our language. And that's where he had, I guess, wanted to set aside those lands for his people, to reserve those lands. So that winter that he asked to spend here, it was a very tough winter. I guess the snow was deep. And towards the spring, the snow was deep and it was a hard winter and the children were hungry. Big Bear was off hunting to try to have one of those spiritual feasts for the people. And a spiritual feast is a way of life of our peoples to show our Father, the Creator, that we enjoy what He has loaned us, and to also show Him that we request His continued blessings upon the people by providing a feast and asking the ones that have departed ahead of us to come and feast with our peoples. And so that's where Big Bear was off hunting. But then his warrior chief, Wandering Spirit, was left at the camp along with his son, Miserable Man. Whether it was his son, I think it was his son, Miserable Man, I'm Cease. And I was told that Wandering Spirit could no longer just listen to the children crying. They're hungry. So he went and asked the Indian agent that was responsible at that time whether or not he was Kapwatamut, was the Sioux speaker. Kaskichaumis Sioux could be Thomas Quinn. Black beard, that's what it meant, Kaskichaumis Sioux. Whether or not he was married to a Sioux woman. Kapwatamut, the one who speaks Sioux. That's what it means. So he went and asked if they could be given rations. But what this Indian agent was a stubborn man, they said. He was a stubborn man. But he refused. He said, go chop wood first, then maybe I'll consider giving you rations. And they responded, Wandering Spirit says it's pretty hard to go chop wood on an empty stomach, where our legs would be shaky and wouldn't have the energy to cut wood. So that Indian agent just refused, and Wandering Spirit told them, 3 times, I will ask you 3 times. If you disagree, then I will shoot you. And Wandering Spirit asked them 3 times. And an Indian agent said no. And so that's where we got shot. And when the shooting started, well, all the young warriors and whatever, they started shooting everybody that was not from our peoples, except they spared a couple of women, I think. And the other man that escaped was put under the dress of a woman and crossed the river under a woman's dress. And they were kept in a teepee by the people from this reserve here, people from the Woods tribe, our peoples here that set aside this reserved land. Those are the Woods people. But the Prairie people were Wandering Spirit, Big Bear, they're Prairie people. And the actions that were taken by our peoples weren't because of one occurrence, one incident. There was talk about, it's still named where the woman lies, Iskokapmsi, near Toleby Lake. There it was said that the RCMP had sexually mutilated and cut off the breast of a woman and threw her in a well. So it wasn't only one incident that led up. There was a lot of other occurrences, a lot of other actions that led up to the frustrations. And this is one of the spirit and intent of the promises made by the Crown, the consent given by the Crown and the Indian nation. If you do business with me, said Alexander Morris at the time of the treaty talks in Carleton and Fort Pitt, if you do business with me, there'll be a ration house at the Indian nations. The bureaucracy of Indian affairs, the Indian agent's house, there will be a ration house that'll always be full. You will never go hungry if you do business with me. And that was one of the spirit and intent and one of the promises made by the Crown. And the Commissioner Alexander Morris expressed that at Fort Carlton and Fort Pitt. It was not something that was said you had to chop wood first or anything like that. But it was a promises that if you done business with me, witsisige mine, kageke. Kaihtago na sa tuga me kageke kasagaskideo. If you do business with me, like I said, there'll always be a ration house and it'll always be full. You will never go hungry as an Indian people. But those are some of the actions that were taken. And that's why Big Bear was reluctant to immediately agree with the adhesions of treaty. Like he said, Bear one tapskuts pam saga pegnat mistatim. Ekai pogite no te tutes. It's just like what Big Bear used for an example. It's the same as putting a rope on a horse's neck and leading him around wherever you wanted to lead it. This is why he was reluctant to agree with the adhesions of treaty. But in regards to Big Bear and what he understood to be the spirit and intent, the Crown promised the King Chief of Canada to set aside lands for himself where there would be no interference. And Big Bear believed that it was for the purpose of putting one big reserve for the Indian nation, one whole reserve. And that was written. But to understand the spirit and intent of treaty, when you talk about King Chief, our King Chief is the creator. And everything that we do is through the creator and his instructions, the way we do things in ceremony, the way we use our ceremonial pipe, the way we use the sweetgrass to smudge today. Those are part of the ways we've been created as a peoples. And when my great-grandfather, Simon Gadwa, when they were visiting in Kihiwan, it used to be Long Lake, just west of here, about 30 kilometers. And they were coming and they saw smoke. They saw smoke rise. And so I don't think it's a good sign, they said. He was with his brother. Simon Gadwa was with his brother. And so they got off their horses and they had a smoke. Or their ceremonial pipe. In consultation, they said wasn't a good incident. Like, nothing good happening. So they rode to the place where the smoke was rising. And Simon Gadwa was a strong believer of the Catholic teachings. And they really favored one of the priests. His name was Yellow Star, Usawa Chakos. And when they got to the site there, the church was burning. And there was a man. His name was one who sits sideways on the land. Ipe aski. Ka ipe ptaski. one who sits sideways on the land. He had his hair tied up in a knot over here, long hair. And Simon Gedwa asked, leaning man, where is Yellow Star? And the leaning man told him, there he is. I guess he was under the church where it was burning, and his mouth was still opening. And Simon Gedwa was going to shoot that man, but his brother tipped his rifle, and his rifle shot up into the air. But leaning man, he pulled out his knife, and Simon Gedwa was angry, but he grabbed the knife by the blade and just broke it. But Simon Gedwa had a scar on his hand throughout his life after that, because he got cut from that knife. This is where I heard up to where my great-grandfather, Simon Gedwa, in regards to the whatever the actions that were taken by the prairie peoples at the reserved lands of Hunipo Hills 121. But I'm not saying that we are a separate, we might be separate tribes, but the Indian nation is composed of the tribes across this country. And the Indian nation has the same directives from the same King Chief who is our creator, and that's how creation was in regards to our constitution, our law. After that, that occurred, the people that were kept in prison, they were kept by a brave from the woods people, and they were kept in a teepee. And there was actually a whip that was used by this. If you scare these people, if you want to continue to scare them or trying to do anything to them, I'll use this whip and I will whip your eyeballs out. This is what one of those braves that were keeping these people that were imprisoned by what occurred. They were being kept by the woods people from this band in a teepee. And whether or not it was Gowan Lock, whatever their names is, whatever, two women, I think, and one man, that's what I heard. Paskapsis was the one, he had one eye missing. I guess this Cameron guy that wrote Blood Red the Sun or whatever, and witnessed whatever, but he was frightened because he wasn't even, I wouldn't say whether or not he soiled his pants or wet his pants, whatever, at that time, because of the fright that was there, because they might have killed him. And they had a powwow after that, and believed that the powwow was held a little bit north of where we sit today, yeah. And in actuality, a chalice was found by my brother, that a Sundance was being held at that place where they had that powwow. And a chalice was found by my late brother, who was one of the twins, and that chalice was exchanged with a priest here. His name was Father Roy, and he was exchanged for a glow-in-the-dark cross. So believing that is where they had the powwow after, and had a party with the bacon and the flour and whatever else they took from the ration house. And I've heard other things, but were long stories, but I will cut it short there up to where my grandfather, what they told, and my mother, and whatever they told, and whatever they had. And in regards to what happened after the things in regards to the rebellion, that's separate from whatever, I guess, gave more fuel to what was happening with the Métis, and where some of my ancestors participated in the rebellion. Yeah. Weshehuin, Dressman, Cumberland House, lots of my great-grandfathers participated in the rebellion. And a lot of stories were told about what happened after some of the things and what occurred at those times. Yeah. Well, you see, it's still the same today when they talk about the truth, when they talk about reconciliation, when they talk about commitment. We as a people, when we are committed, when you make a commitment, you have to do it. It's not something that's discretionary. And when the Indian nation consented, they consented to what the Crown of Great Britain, the spirit and intent of 1665 was the King Charles II, when he proposed the spirit and intent. And then Queen Victoria, after 200 years of deliberation across this country, and all the Métis and whatever and whoever translated the proposed spirit and intent to the Indian nation across this country. And then when Queen Victoria reaffirmed that it was in agreement by the Indian nation across this country to be the spirit and intent of what they consented that they were going to do if the Indian nation allowed the subjects of the Crown to come to this land. So it was a great commitment in ceremony by the Indian nation. It was marked with the sacred seal by the Indian nation across this country. And the discussions and the things that happened, we may not have all agreed to the many things. But it was pretty well the consent by the Indian nation as to what was the spirit and intent. That you will continue to have what you've had before. We did not come here to trade as if we were to trade for a horse. We came here to put it on top of. To put on top of what? Well, what we had before. What was given the spirit and intent, the consent by the Crown, that was there. It was already pretty well across this country an agreement by the Indian nation to conclude a treaty with the Crown of Great Britain. And the Commissioner, Alexander Morris, traveled from one region to another region, getting adhesions from the various regions, from the tribes of the various regions, adhesions to a treaty, to one treaty with the Crown of Great Britain. And when you have a bureaucracy of Indian affairs that's supposed to work for the Indian nation, that's supposed to administer the consent given by the Indian nation and the Crown of Great Britain, you had a bureaucracy that was put into place. And it was promised that a lawyer would be put in place to help do business for the Indians. And we've never had that. That has never been fulfilled by the Crown of Great Britain. We've never had legal counsel. Any legal counsel that's been hired by the Indians, they all swear an oath to Canadian policy. So we've never been represented. And how do I feel? Well, I feel pretty confused. Although the truth in regards to the commitment, when you talk about truth and reconciliation, what is truth? How can there be reconciliation without the truth? You cannot put reconciliation ahead of the truth. When a confederacy was formed by Sir John A. Macdonald and the premiers, confederacy is for the purpose of being unlawful, for the purpose of conspiracy. So the fathers of confederation, they violated the treaty that was consented between the Crown of Great Britain and the Indian nation by illegally taking on a policy and calling it the Indian Act. That's not the Indian Act, it's a White Man Act. Now that's the truth. The Father Confederation. Today, it continues the conspiracy. The Canadian government continue to conspire. The so-called chief and councils are not chief and councils. They're a board appointed by the federal government. You vote while you're breaking your constitution. The Indian nation's constitution is not about discretionary. It's about commitment. You don't vote for a chief and council. You commit a chief and council to honor the Creator's law. And they are committed in ceremony. Oh, the Canadian government is on a path to assimilate us, to integrate us, whatever. To incorporate us to become corporate citizens of the federal government. Under so many things that maybe you want to go order or out of order. But you asked me, how do I feel? I'm telling you how I feel about the truth. And about what went on. Why did it happen? Because of the actions that the bureaucracy of Indian Affairs and its Indian agents and the RCMP were given to us to be equally accessible by our nation so that there be peace, order, and good governance. And that the bureaucracy of Indian Affairs had given to us a lawyer to help do our business. That the Indian Act is supposed to be the Indians' Act in accordance to being compliant to our constitutional law. That the Indian Act is the business of the Indian, not a foreign government to call it democracy. You can't call that democracy. That's dictatorship. How do I feel if you don't have access to your own country, your own resources? 5% of the mines and minerals. This is the spirit and intent promised by Queen Victoria when he revisited the 1665 proposed spirit and intent. 5% of the mines and minerals is clearly written. 3% of the taxes collected. 3% of the lumber industry, plus $3 stumpage beside. If you're going to hunt our animals and fish our waters, a warden will be provided to mind your game, our game. You will have to pay for it with a license to hunt our animals and to fish our waters. 100% of that money is supposed to go into our treasury. Where is the treasury of the Indian nation? Where is the nation to nation? When Rupert's land was sold by the Hudson Bay Company to Canada, well, the Crown sued Hudson Bay. And that money still sits there. Nobody has ever claimed it. $120 per year, whether that's per capita or whatever. And it will earn 5% per annum. Your monies will earn 5%. Where is our revenue today? It's consolidated under Revenue Canada. The Indian nation is supposed to have a bureaucracy of Indian affairs that's supposed to work for us. And an Indian Act in compliance to the Indian nation's constitution. Where is the revenue of the Indian nation? But the Commonwealth country over here, where the Crown continues to receive benefits from our resources in this country. Where are the monies that is stolen by the subjects of the Crown? Where is our treasury when it was promised to us? Kakstapit sunyao, they said. Kakstapit. If you're on a wheelchair, it means you sit there you can't walk. And this was the same description of the financial situation of how our monies is supposed to be. Kakstapit sunya. Sunya means money. It's supposed to sit there, not supposed to have legs to walk anywhere else. But it's been hijacked by the fathers of Confederation who drafted an Indian Act. Now what about the Indians today? They're trying to throw out the Indian Act when it's an integral part of the treaty. The Indian Act is not the Indian Act, it's the White Man's Act. We've never begun to draft the Indian Act, as was consented by the Crown and the Indian nation. And it's supposed to be enforceable by law. That's why the RCMP, we're supposed to have equal access to the courts, to the Supreme Courts, and we're supposed to legislate law. We will sit across the table from each other to legislate law. These are the words that were used by Alexander Morris, and Alexander Morris knew about the consent of the Crown of Great Britain and the consent of the Indian nation. And he expressed that by traveling across this country from region to region, and everything else was put on top of. Now, will that truth ever come out? Am I telling the truth? It's written. It's also a part of the oral history of our people that interrelates with the written. And whatever happened here is because of the actions of a bureaucracy that was untruthful to what was consented to by the Crown. Without interference, one of the big words, there has been a lot of interference when I tell you that the federal government is still conspiring with our chief and councils, which are not chief and councils. These chief and councils are impersonators of chief and councils. It's illegal under the policy of the Canadian government to impersonate anybody. But they're still impersonating. They don't represent our people. They represent a driven conspiracy by a foreign government, the federal government, to control our people under their corporate structures, under their corporate law. The monies are supposed to be held in trust for our peoples. And they're supposed to be annuities, nothing else but annuities. When they done a census not too long ago, 5-year census, well, what was consented by our peoples and is annual census. It's an annual census. Every year is Treaty Day, $5. And you were recorded to be the beneficiary to the benefits of treaty for the Indian nation. On the other side, it's the subjects of the Crown. But the annuities now, they try to put us into being Canadian citizens, so they include us under their census to try and put us as Canadian citizens. We are not, first and foremost, I'm not a Canadian citizen, I'm an Indian nation citizen. Recorded by a bureaucracy of Indian affairs to be Larry Francis Quinney. Treaty number 294. Beneficiary to the treaty on our side. And it's supposed to be held in trust by the Crown with the bureaucracy of Indian affairs working for us. Now, how do I feel of what happened and how it has affected all these things that have been committed? What is the truth? What is commitment? To what's commitment? When you do make a commitment, you're making a commitment to the Creator. And I have to do what I committed to do. And why that's the way the Crown committed the same. When there is a coronation of the Crown, you know that there's a great big long ceremony when they trade the crown, whoever the successor is. They swear upon the Bible. All these coronation, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. And it's the same here with our people when the chief and headmen are committed. It's the same thing. So I don't know why there is so much turbulence and whatever, so much disorder when Alberta wants to separate, Saskatchewan wants to separate, Quebec wants to separate. Where do they get the idea? When the Crown consented and the Indian nation consented that you cannot divvy up Mother Earth like a piece of pemmican and divide it amongst each other. It was concluded by the Crown, the same commitment, for as long as the sun will shine. It's written by the Crown. This is what the spirit and intent, why the Indian nation consented. The Crown said so, wrote, so long as the sun will shine, so long as the moon will shine, so long as there's water in the lakes and run in the rivers and creeks, so long as there's an Indian from generation to generation, my words shall last forever. This written under the spirit and intent. And that's what was deliberated by the Indian nation across this country. And it was finally agreed by the Indian nation, pretty well deliberated across this country. And so it was concluded that we will make a treaty with the Crown of Great Britain. And everything was put in place with all the adhesions and everything else. And I don't know why things have happened when there was commitments made. Why has the bureaucracy of Indian affairs worked against our people? Why have they flipped everything around? The commitments were made and everything is turned over backwards, where we have to assimilate and integrate. Where it was, they had to assimilate and integrate. The RCMP have to learn our ways, the assimilation and integration. We agreed to be educated, sure, but we never agreed to be imprisoned by a curriculum developed to get rid of the Indian. I don't have nothing against people. I just have, sometimes we are ignorant. Why do I use the term ignorant? Because we have not been told the truth. And nobody's willing to tell the truth. Even the lawyers are not willing to tell the truth because they're sworn oath to uphold Canadian policy. So the RCMP. Why do they work for only the Canadian policy and the Canadian government? Well, it's here, the Truth and Reconciliation. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have been hijacked. The Truth and Reconciliation composed of peoples who have sworn oath to uphold Canadian policy. And again, they're imprisoned by the Canadian political party business. Party policy. An Indian Affairs agent is not supposed to be an Indian Affairs minister. An Indian Affairs agent is a buffer zone between the Crown's governments and the Indian nation's governments. That's the bureaucracy of Indian affairs. But there's so much when our elders, you talk about health and wellness. They give you health and wellness. What is health and wellness? Health and wellness is just something that's driving our people to be more mentally ill. Truth and reconciliation. Am I developing to be more mentally ill by knowing too much over here and by being confused about what is the truth? How is reconciliation going to come about? I think I talked too much, I said too much, but where is this going to go? Is this something that's going to be used for the purpose of probably sitting in the back rooms where the government has sat together as political parties and planned and strategized as to how they're going to continue suppressing our peoples by using terminology such as treaty land entitlement? I will give you treaty land entitlement. Where does your jurisdiction come to give me treaty land entitlement? But it's worked that way. Why? How can a Canadian government, we never made a treaty with them, how can they give me treaty land entitlement? It's already been finished as to how we were going to share this land. How can you give me traditional territory? But the Canadian government writes traditional territory policy. This will be traditional territory. This is where you hunt, fish, and trap and collect your medicines. But because we gave it a natural resource transfer agreement to the provincial government for their control and administration, that you are now controlled by the Alberta government, by the provincial government, to tell you where you can hunt, fish, and trap and collect your medicine. Traditional territory. Well, how can an Indian go run to the federal government and ask them for traditional territory when it's not their jurisdiction? It's already been done. Traditional territory has been since the time of creation. We've always shared, respected. I didn't just go upon your little berry patch there and just go pick berries. No, I ask you, can I pick berries where there's berries on your land? But over here it froze, and there's no more berries, but it was no good summer. These are traditional territories. These are traditional lands where we hunt, fish, and share. But how can the government give you self-government? How can Canada give you self-government when they're not even a government, when they're just a state? And the head of state is the Crown of Great Britain, who gives a royal assent when this state wants to do something. But over here, the Crown cannot interfere with a sovereign. We are a sovereign. Why do we need to go right to the Crown? We, as a people, have to know that we are a nation. I can't separate what Big Bear done and his people from our people. We are all a part of that. We all are part of the actions that happened. I don't think Big Bear was wrong in regards to some of the actions. I don't think wandering spirit was wrong. Maybe he didn't have to shoot the guy. Maybe he could have tied him up or something. But and then they could have taken the rations and had fed the children. Well, I guess you get angry in ways. I guess people take ugly actions. Ugly actions because not really clearly thinking when your children are crying and hungry. And when an Indian agent tells you to go chop wood before you eat. Well, these are some of the things that have occurred. And if it was more of the honoring the commitment the way it was, rather than as Sir John A. Macdonald formulating the Fathers of Confederation to conspire and to be unlawful in accordance to the Indian nation's constitution and the enforceability of the Indian Act. As written in accordance to the Indians' constitution, where a lawyer was supposed to be given to help do our business. We've never had a lawyer to represent the Indian nation and its constitutional law. But I'm telling you what is supposed to be. But is there going to be the truth? Now you tell me how I feel. I've given you maybe too much. Well, yeah, but there could have been wiser decisions that could have been made. They probably could have waited for their social chief. And that's the difference between a war chief and a social chief.
You're saying social chief?
Yeah. This is the one. There was a political chief, more or less, in regards to the peace, order, and good governance of his people. But when the war chief, when the war chief took over, he took over. That was the wandering spirit. And there's a difference between the war chief and the overall chief to keep peace and good order. But he was out hunting. There could have been better deliberations made and better decisions made if it wasn't for wandering spirit, who was probably just made to be one of the war chiefs. And I believe that he's seen greater actions that were taken by a bureaucracy of Indian affairs and by a peoples that did promise and commit by the consent of the Crown of Great Britain. And it wasn't followed through. Whereas you'll never starve. Your children will never be hungry. You'll never go hungry if you do business with me. But that commitment was a commitment. And it wasn't handled in the best interest of everyone by a stubborn man. What did he have to lose? This guy, if he would have opened the ration house, go ahead, eat. Would have been better. Why did he have to be so stubborn and say, no, go chop wood first? Were those rations all his? Or did they come from the government? You question these things because of the actions that were taken by whatever you think of, whatever the rationalization of what happened. It wasn't only that, though, but our peoples have expressed that other things were done to cause our people to be stirred up by the occurrences. And it wasn't only one thing that happened. You think about your buffalo. What happened to Almighty Voice when he killed a cow? That was a bureaucracy of Indian affairs cow that's supposed to feed her people, the people of the Indians. When his daughter was sick and he went and killed a cow to nourish her daughter. Well, Almighty Voice was blown out of the pit. Because he killed cow. But what did the white man do to try to control the Indians. They slaughtered all our buffalo. So you think about these things, come on my side, think about what I think. Yeah. I also don't absolutely say it's all the white man's fault and I hate the white man for doing these things. No. It's just that we need diplomacy. We need to have diplomatic relations. We need to be committed in that peace and good order as to what was committed between two peoples that made a treaty as to how we were going to share. I will end it there.